Hello, my name is Kim Davenport, and I am the Communications Manager for Tacoma Historical Society. It is my great pleasure today to be interviewing David Williams about his new book, Homewaters, a human and natural history of Puget Sound, which I had the pleasure of reading over the past few weeks and found to be just a wonderful combination of, as the title said, both human history and natural scientific history of our region. So I'm very excited to ask him some questions and hopefully get you excited about picking up his book. So thank you for being with me today, David.
My pleasure. This is great. It's fun, so much fun, and great to connect down into Tacoma, because for the first time I have Tacoma in a book. I normally have just focused on Seattle. So for me, it's been a great pleasure to reach out and expand the geography of what interests me, but also to connect more broadly to this place that is my home.
It's great. Yeah, thank you. So my first question is, can you, especially after reading the book and seeing how much scope it really takes on, can you describe what led you to get started on this project? Because it's certainly a big project, and it might have seemed a little daunting at first, but was there a particular spark that got it started for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Oddly enough, it just popped into my head one day that I want to write a book about human and natural history of Puget Sound. And I didn't really know what that meant. I mean, for instance, I didn't even really know what Puget Sound was, in the sense of what are the geographic boundaries, which obviously I discuss in the book. And so I had this idea and did what I always do when I get interested in an idea, is I started reading about it. And I also then spent about the next 5 months interviewing people. I reached out to scientists, I reached out to historians, I tried to reach out to tribal members and ask them, what is Puget Sound and what are the important stories that you think people need to know? And based on that, that's what led down the route I took on the chapters. I had certainly had some inklings of ideas. I'd been interested by the forts at the north. I always point geographically. The forts up there, as you can see them just outside my door, forts up in the north. And I've been, of course, intrigued by, what's up with geoduck. I knew, as often happens with books that I start on, I knew enough to have a feel that there was a story, but I didn't really know how deep the story was until I really headed into it. And so, like all of them, all the books I've done, always way more interesting than I ever knew when I started.
Yeah, so you hint at my next question, actually, that there are a lot of different stories that you could have chosen to include, and obviously you had to limit that at some point because there's only so many pages you wanted to write, or we can expect readers to read.
Right, exactly. Both.
So,
Both.
so you share a wide range of stories. There's stories about people. There's stories about animals and plants that live in the Sound. There's stories from more distant past and more recent past. How did you decide which stories you would be including in the book?
Yeah, the 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 natural history ones were really based on who I could go out in the field with, and that was a big driver for me. That was fun, and I mean also, and the history ones are just ones that sort of leapt out at me. There's, as you can imagine, there's a lot of what I wrote didn't end up in the book because I write stuff out and it just didn't feel right. And it's one of the challenges of being a natural history writer. And when I use that phrase, to me, I use it very specifically because to me, natural history means the nature of a place and the history of a place. And so that's what's always driven me. And so I'm always interested in the background stories. I'm always interested in the history of, what connects people, what connects the stories to place. And so that was sort of a driver for me, is to share stories that were in such a way that it would help the reader. And in this essence, I mean, I am the reader, help me and understand, how did species adapt to place? How did humans adapt to place? So I was always interested in that. And that was the thread that I wanted to weave through. So when it went in a different direction, where it may have just been purely totally cool, it didn't make it into the book. Stuff would get dropped from that point. So it was really this idea of what are the connections and how do I help people see them, and particularly the connections that go in all directions and not just one direction of moving an idea.
Mhm. Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest themes that I certainly picked up on, is that everything about our environment, the sound and the people who live here, and we're all part of this large ecosystem, and
Hmm.
everything is interrelated. And I thought you did a fantastic job of weaving
Yeah.
those stories together, even as we move, from one chapter's about geoducks and one chapter's about, the mosquito fleet. And it might not be obvious on the surface how these different things are related, but that's one of the things that I thought was so fascinating about
Oh,
um,
great. Yeah.
those stories.
Yay!
So kind of along those lines, what was the most surprising and or interesting thing that you learned while you were doing the research for the book?
Well, the classic line I always toss out in the beginning when that question is asked is, how cute geoduck babies are. Oh my God. They are the cutest little animal. They've got this little shell and that little neck that sticks up and goes wiggle, wiggle. They're just super cute. So that was probably the most exciting, just from a cute point of view. Um, but I also think I was intrigued by how people have moved in and adapted over time to place. One aspect of the story, and this I think reveals my myopia and my Seattle-centric world view, is Seattle begins in 1851, roughly, European settlement, but South Sound begins much earlier, and I couldn't figure out, why did people begin in the South Sound if they were sailing in? And then this realization is like, oh, they didn't sail into the South Sound, they came overland from the south into the sound. And so that was really a surprise for me. I didn't realize that aspect of the story. And then, I mean, some of the just natural history facts were amazing, that we have fish that live for 150, 200 years, that geoduck live for 170 years, that there's 28 species of rockfish in Puget Sound, that kelp is sort of this incredible forest. So lots of little details like that
Yeah, that's
really surprised me.
well, I didn't know that geoduck babies were cute, so I appreciate learning that. But but I really thought it was profound your statement about learning that there are fish that live that long, and realizing that they will have seen an actual, animal in the sound would have seen all of this history that we tend to
Mhm.
talk about. That's an amazing and completely new fact to me as well. So that's absolutely fascinating. Um, why do you think, and I know you think this is important because you wouldn't have written the book otherwise, why do you think it's important that people who live in this region understand the history of the sound?
Yeah, I mean, that as you say, that was really a driver for me in this, and I think it gets back to a couple things. One is, when European settlers first moved into Puget Sound, there was this relationship really based on exploitation, on acquiring the fish, the trees, and using them for their purposes, basically, obviously selling them. And those early people who arrived here, understandably, could not possibly imagine that they would ever deplete the resources of this landscape. I mean, to have been here at the time when, over the thousands of years that Native people were here, and just unrivaled quantities and abundance of fish and shellfish and trees. So that was the early history. But over time, and really in the last 20 or 30 years, 40 years, we've really changed to a point of viewing the sound with stewardship and sustainability. So I think in helping to understand where we are now, it really helps to understand those past stories, how people used the land, how people defended the land, because I think that's also important. It's understanding of, again, it gets back to what we were talking about. It gets back to a connection and a relationship between people and place. And so I wanted to tell these stories, to look at the past, to understand that. And you can think about that purely from a human aspect, but then you can also look at it from all the stories I'm telling about kelp. Why are people concerned about kelp? Why are people concerned that we don't have the Olympia oyster population? Why are people concerned that herring and rockfish, that their populations are down. In order to think of ways to move forward, I think it very much helps to understand the past and how we got to where we are right now.
Yeah, and that really brings me to a theme that I found is fascinating in this book, because so much of it does focus around, for lack of a better word, what we might call, it's a science book. There's a lot of talk about science, and you're interviewing scientists, and yet there was a theme that was so familiar to me as a historian, which is so many of the scientists that you talk to refer to the frustration of not always having a complete historical record in order to understand, if they go out and collect data about, how much kelp is in this particular place in the sound, how do we know what that means if we don't have a record from 10 and 20 and 30 years ago,
Right.
or 500 years ago? And this is the same thing that frustrates historians, that if we don't have a complete record, how do we know how much of our history we really understand? So was that a theme that you were aware of when you were writing, that you were trying to share, or did I just pick up on that because that's a soapbox I like to get on about how important it is for us to capture and record our history?
Combination, probably. I think you're picking it out, and in a way that I probably took a while to perceive as I talked to different biologists. I mean, I definitely talked to people who have been frustrated by not knowing that history. And I think that's a really key point. I mean, certain things, salmon, yeah, we've got a pretty good picture of what we've done to salmon, but a lot of these species, exactly, we don't know what their abundance was and how much we've changed. We know that it's been on a downward trend, but is it a downward trend, or is it a natural dip in the population? That's one of the questions that's often asked. And with all the time I spent with scientists, I was struck by their concern about the history, but also just the concern about getting the data that's out there right now. It's, as you might imagine, say you want to get the data on a squirrel. The squirrel's above ground all the time. You can see it, you can track it, and something goes underwater. It's just a lot more challenging, and it creates some different challenges for the researcher. And that was, for me, really one of the pleasures, was to be able to go out in the field with and see those researchers and see them trying to figure out what was going on, to see their passion for the subject. So yeah, I think they're getting more and more that way. And one of the things that also struck me, though, sort of maybe in converse to that, is that I was often digging up data that they just didn't know about, some of them. And it's understandable. We all get linear tracked in our focus. And I was, by taking that broad brush and that broad picture approach, I could attack some of these stories and think of ways to dive into them that the researchers weren't able to do. But I was still, there was always that one person, Dr. Smith. She was one who was passionate about, I got to get all the data, and she'd dig down, and then I'd go up to her and corkscrew her brain and extract everything out I could. So that was real. That I felt fortunate that there are always people doing that research, often.
And honestly, I think one of the things that I found most, I don't know what the word is I'm going for here. I mean, interesting, certainly, but bigger than that, I guess, it was sort of a profound experience, actually, in reading the book, is that we do tend, as you mentioned, to be on our own little path of our own education, or our own subject area, or our own interests. And yet all of these things being so interrelated, I very much enjoyed a couple of things about your approach. One was the way that I found you humanized scientists that you talked to. You would introduce them as Dr. So-and-so, and they teach at this university and they research these things. But then the rest of the conversation and the rest of the description, you used their first name and made clear that you went out on their boat with them and you spent hours together. And I think it really helps the reader to realize these people aren't, they're just doing a job like I do, and trying to get to the bottom of the mystery they're trying to understand. And I guess I just really enjoyed the mixing of, we have a lot of science, but it's not overwhelming, I don't think, to the average reader to understand. And then we also have the history, the more human history, and they're all kind of intermixed together, which represents that diversity of how all these things are interrelated. I found that really engaging about how you approached it.
Thank you. And I think that's the story of any place. And I mean, I think that's one of the challenges, and one also to me, some of the frustration of books that I sometimes read is when they focus too much on one or the other, which is always good. But sometimes I think, to me, I want to think about, okay, well, how does the nature of a place inform the human stories of a place? I mean, just, for instance, with rockfish and coming into this area and not understand, the biologists initially not understanding any of the biology of rockfish, thinking that, oh, salmon, they live a handful of years, probably most fish live a handful of years. But then they discover that rockfish can live for well over 100 years, 150 years, and that completely changes the management of that animal. But without that information, we wouldn't have it. And so it's the science informs the management, which is then informed by the history, which connects back to this. Yeah, exactly. So, and I have a quote in the book at one point having to do with shellfish, and people saying, oh, the scientists just do this they find the data they want to find. And, I was out in the field with scientists from every level, and every one of them was, I'm trying to get the best data I can. I want this place to be better. I want to help make it sustainable. I mean, there's a guy I was working with about rockfish and the Endangered Species Act, and he said, I don't expect our data to change things, but I want our data to help inform the story for people to make better decisions. And that was basically all the scientists I met were that way.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't warn you that I was going to ask this question, but it pops into my mind now. So you talked to a lot of scientists, and you did a lot of your own research, and you also referenced several times through the book conversations with tribal representatives and that native understanding of this place. What was the biggest takeaway for you about your understanding of that element of the story?
I think it was two levels. One is this, many of the tribal people I spoke with, feeling that their opinions, their thoughts were based on that deep historical connection that they have, that these were, when decisions were made, when observations were made, it wasn't just through the lens of someone who had been out in the field for a few years. This was through the lens of people who've lived here for thousands and continue to live here. So that was very important. And also about the idea of sustainability, that there's this interconnectedness between, as we've talked about, through all the different species. So that was a second point. I guess a third point I would add is having a relationship with place. I think it's the very end of the book, I just sort of talk about, one way for people to be better stewards, to think more sustainable, is to have that relationship, is to get out on the land, or to get out on the water and spend time on the shore, spend time getting to know that natural world that's out there. And that really, I felt, was informing a lot of the knowledge and passion that was shared with me from the both tribal members and tribal biologists who may not have been tribal members, but were part of that community and saw the world in that way.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to that. Is there anything that my questions haven't given you a chance to talk about, especially from the perspective of, you mentioned early on that this book gave you the chance to explore the South Sound a little bit more. So especially with our audience of Tacoma history enthusiasts, is there anything you'd like to share that you haven't had a chance to yet?
I mean, I think, I think the South Sound, what struck me, and one, as I said, is just that initial idea that the South Sound is where Europeans first move into this area. So we start to see as early as the 1820s with the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Nisqually, establishing that proper land down there and a connection down there. And then you just sort of start to see that area grow and grow. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect, I think, is the mosquito fleet. And that, I think, again, Seattle always likes to claim credit for everything, which is, you know, a bunch of hooey. When it was such a central part of the development of the South Sound as well. And equally, you know, that's where the first really mosquito fleet vessels were. They're based out of the South Sound. They're moving people up and down. They're moving goods up and down. So that, to me, was a really a big part of the story that I just didn't know. And then the other part of it was just being down there, and it's such a different feel in the South Sound than in the North Sound. The North Sound I think of as big bluffs, you know, up along Whidbey, the rising out of the water, and then as you head south, as the land sort of slopes down, there are less bluffs, but there's that, but you then have all those fingered landscape of all the bays and inlets, and it's such a different feel between the North and the South. And one of the things that I think I left it as a footnote in the book, I'm trying to remember if I did or not, but the idea that people used to refer to the South Sound as going up sound. And that if you went so from Seattle to Olympia, I'd be going up sound. And from Olympia to, say, Bellingham, I was going down sound. And I thought that was just a really curious way to think about it. But it makes sense because it's a watershed and the water is flowing down. That's the South Sound is the upper end of the ecosystem of the watershed there. So I thought that was to me fun, just to think about that idea of how this place fits together as a whole, that it did develop differently and there are different relationships, but ultimately still that deep connection that all these places have to that waterway. You just can't separate these communities from the water.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last question I have for you is, especially now that I'm a fan and I very much enjoyed reading this book, what future projects do you have that you're working on now that we should be on the lookout for?
I'm working on a book about fossils in Washington State. That's definitely an interesting project for me because I'm working with a scientist, a retired paleontologist from the Burke Museum up here. And she's basically the science, and then I'm helping write and work it together. So that's been a fun project. And I'm trying to figure out a next book project. I very much chose a handful of years ago, 10 years ago, that I would write about the world where I live, write about this regional landscape, and not try and do projects that were way out there. I wanted to be a place-based writer who tries to take that long view of the place where I live. So I'm continuing searching. I'm maybe tying something into the Anthropocene. I haven't figured that out. There's just so much out there. And one thing that about this book that I really found enjoyable was that, to me, it did have a message to it. The previous books I've done about Seattle, which have been a little bit more historical, even though there's a lot of natural history in them. Unlike those, this one I wouldn't call this an activist book, but I feel it's a book that allowed me to encourage people to act in a way, to point to hopefully maybe inspire them that we do live at a time in Puget Sound where it's in better shape than it's been in a long time. And we have an opportunity to continue to make it better. And I'm hoping that this book will point people in that direction, inspire them, and give them hope. I really did want to write a book with hope in it, and didn't want to write, everything's bad. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of problems, but there's also reason to be hopeful. There are people who are really working on restoration. There are people who are taking the time to better understand those deeper human stories so that we have more respect for the cultures that have been here and continue to be here for thousands of years. So that's still driving me as a writer. And so I want to stay in the Pacific Northwest, stay in this region, and continue seeking out those stories. So if you have a good one, let me know.
That's,
always
it's
looking.
wonderful. I mean, I think we need more of that, and you're doing a wonderful job. And I very much look forward to the next project that you come out with. It's all of the scientists I have ever known and worked with always have expressed the struggle of getting data and information out to people. And so the type of work you're doing is really helpful in that way, that it needs to be distilled and explained and put into context and not be raw data that people feel that they understand. And so it's really important work, and keeping it so local means that it really has an impact in our region right here. So I very much appreciated it, and I for one will be looking out for your next book.
Great, cool.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to hold this one up again, and hopefully we've gotten some people excited about this. Homewaters, just recently released by UW Press. And thank you so much for your time. It's been really wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Kim. It's been fun too. Great. I enjoyed your questions.